Good morning on this bright, sunny, beautiful day here in Arad. We're going to continue with our focus on God making nations on the earth.
Mhm.
So we left off last week, I believe, with Noah, or up to Noah going, having this flood.
Yeah.
So basically, we have Noah and his three sons and their wives go into this. They come out, and at the end of chapter 9, we know that God has given some instructions. Tells how long Noah lived, and we already have met Ham and Shem and Japheth and how they're responding after the flood. And then chapter 10 tells us the lines of Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Right.
And then it tells us at the end of chapter 10, these are the descendants of Shem according to their clans and languages, by their lands according to their nations. According to their nations. These are the groupings of Noah's descendants according to their origin by nations.
Mhm.
And from these nations branch out over the earth after the flood.
Wow.
So the focus really here, still in Genesis, is making nations that will live before God and do the right thing.
So when God said multiply and replenish the earth, he wasn't just saying people, but he had organization and government in mind.
Right. This is one of the scriptures that certainly points this out, because he gave that same instruction again to Noah.
Right.
But then we get chapter 11 and we find out, that this is how it really happened. They didn't do it of their own volition. Instead, they gathered together and made this city-state situation. And they didn't call upon God. They followed a man who made himself great. But one of the things that's really important to see here, one, they became nations according to families, groups, and they became nations as with the same language.
Right.
They started out with one nation or one language. They were becoming one single nation, but they weren't spreading out over the earth.
Right.
So God confused the language.
Yeah.
And this is how he scattered them over the earth, because they weren't doing what he had commanded.
But in chapter 10, he uses a plural, doesn't it? Nations?
Yes, by their nations.
Okay, that's interesting.
Now, yes, it is interesting, because the Jews have counted these names and says there's 70.
Yeah, 70 nations.
And so they feel that there are designated 70 nations on the earth, which is in the ballpark of the number of Israelites that went down to Egypt.
Oh, that's right.
And somehow or another, they feel there's a connection. And the connection, again, comes out in Deuteronomy 32, where God says, I gave all the lands to the nations by the number of the sons of Israel. So they take it as 70 that went to Egypt, whereas sometimes I think more in terms of 12.
Do you remember that reference in Deuteronomy?
I think it's Deuteronomy 32:8.
Okay.
So they got scattered because they had their language confused.
Right.
And it's interesting that God confused the language that separated families. He kept the families together. And then we get Shem's line again with we're getting Abraham's line from Shem.
Right.
We don't get it for all of his descendants.
Yeah.
And then God says, go from your native land. He was
Right.
born in Ur,
Right. You're talking to
or maybe
Abraham.
he was born in Haran, and they went to Ur and came back.
Mhm.
And from your father's house to the land. So God is focusing on land.
Mhm.
And then the next sentence says, I will make you a great nation.
Yeah. Wow.
So the focus is not, am I going to save my world? That's going to be the outcome.
Right.
But the focus is, I'm making a nation.
Very clear.
I want
It's very
to,
clear. It's there.
yes. And because he knows these others, even though they have their instruction, in which the Jews say were 7 commandments, make just nations, and Hammurabi did make a good code, a good covenant, but none of them really acknowledged God like Abraham was. Abraham threw out all the false idols and gods and said, and so how do we know that? We'll show you how that comes about. But God says, you go to the land and I will make you a great nation.
Right.
And I'll make your name great there. And you're going to bless the whole earth.
Yeah.
So he knows that somehow Abraham and the people descended from him would set an example of how to make a functioning, a good nation. And so Abraham obeys. Now, Abraham goes into Canaan. There's no borders. It's not a nation. They don't say, oh, check in here. We got to see whether we want you here or not.
Yeah.
They did. There was
Well,
no.
they had kings and kingdoms.
They had kings of cities
Of cities, yeah, right. But
or
they weren't-
villages.
they weren't
The
really
cities
nations.
were hardly cities. They
Yeah.
were just little tribal groups.
Mhm.
And so there was nobody stopping Abraham from coming into the land. And so we,
That's like what they had in Afghanistan, these chiefs or something from
yeah.
different cities.
Now, what Abraham did was he built an altar and he acknowledged God in that place. He moved further south and built another altar, acknowledged God. But he found that there was famine in the land that was very severe after he got there.
Right.
And instead of trusting God, he goes down to Egypt.
Right.
Now, Egypt was a nation.
Yeah.
Because he had to stop at the border and give an account of who he was
Mhm.
and what he was coming there to do, etc.
Interesting.
So now we know that land,
Mhm.
people,
Mhm.
and a border
Mhm.
makes a nation. Those are some of the things that
Right.
make a
Very
nation.
interesting. Right.
So we're going to find out what makes a good nation.
Okay.
Okay? So he ends up having to leave Egypt because of this deal with his wife. And he goes back to the Negev, no problem going in, no nation there. But there is some Canaanites there, but they didn't have to deal with him right then. And Lot, his nephew, has to choose another place because of the land not being able to hold all of their possessions. So Lot chooses to go down into the rich valley of Sodom, where Sodom and Gomorrah were, and it was green down there. It was fertile. They had water from the Jordan.
Mhm.
And we don't know how big at that time the Dead Sea was, or if it was just
Well, we don't know.
yeah, we don't know how much, but we know they had tar pits there. So in chapter 14, there's this battle between 5 kings from the what we call the Babylon area,
Yeah.
or they call it Chaldean, and the 4 kings that aligned themselves with Sodom and Gomorrah as the major kings. And they won over them and took Lot and his wife and a lot of their people and their goods.
They rescued him.
So then Abraham finds out about this, and he goes out and wins with 300 men over all these 5 kings and comes back with Lot and his goods.
Right.
But when he comes back, he and the king of Sodom meet King Melchizedek of Salem, who brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed him. And he blessed him because it was God who had delivered his foes into his hands. So here we have Abraham giving him 1/10 of everything.
Right.
So Abraham is acknowledging that God on high was what gave him the victory
Right.
over these kings.
Right.
But the king of Sodom wants to give Abraham all of his possessions, and he'd just take the persons. Now, Abraham says, I'm not taking anything from you because I don't want you to say I made Abraham rich. In other words, if I take what you have, I will not be acknowledging that it was God who is with me and making me rich.
Wow. Wow.
I gave my 10th to God because I'm acknowledging him. So he's saying that God is the head king of this nation or government that he's going to build out of me.
Right.
And Sodom is taking the line that I'm the guy that's in charge and I can give out and take in or whatever. So at that point now, God marks, he has this little ceremonial deal with Abraham where he says, I'm your shield and I'm your reward. I'm your protector and I'm the one that's the source of all of your blessings. God is not setting up a religion here.
Okay.
Because Abraham already has a relationship with him.
Right. Right.
If you have a relationship with God, it's not a religion because you're not seeking to find out how to reach God or to connect with him. Actually, we all should be trying to find out how we're connected to God because we are connected to God.
Mm-hmm.
And
We
just don't know it, and he does.
Yeah, he's a creator.
And he put this neshama in every person.
Mm-hmm.
And through that neshama, we have a connection with him. So if we're not acknowledging the connection, we feel disconnected. But he's there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Abraham knew this connection with God. And so God says, well, you're going to be a great nation. And so I want you to, when they made a covenant, and he says, you're going to have a child by Sarah. And I'm going to give you your offspring this land. And he marks from Egypt River to the Euphrates River.
Wow.
It's a huge piece of land.
Mm-hmm.
It's never been that great.
Right.
But here we have the borders.
Mm-hmm.
No nation is without borders.
Right.
A real nation has borders. So borders, land, a God, and organized, we'll get into that later.
Okay.
So there's only one thing left that maybe we can cover today. God says, I'm marking you.
Oh.
Okay, we mark cattle. This one is mine, and I put a brand on it.
Mm-hmm.
God says, I'm putting a brand on you because I want you and everyone in your household to be branded this way so that I can say, this is mine. And anyone who doesn't follow through, he's not mine. Now, when he means mine, it means for this particular nation. He's not disqualifying people from building other nations or being in other lands. And he's not saying that they aren't connected to him. They have the connection. They just have to acknowledge it. But he says, you are particularly my possession. I'm going to use you, and he doesn't say that in so many words, but he does later, to be an example, a witness to the world.
Wow.
Okay, let's end it there and we'll start next week again.
Okay.
So have a good week and we'll see you next time.